Okay, we'll get started in just a moment. I'll press the record button. I'm recording in the cloud, Ezra. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, great. And now I'm going to share a document. And we'll get started in just a moment. Everyone, today is Moreh Nevukhim, section 1, chapter 57. The topic of our discussion today is the unique meanings of existence, oneness, and eternality as pertain to God. And it's a mouthful, so I'll explain everything that we mean here. I just wanted to share the screen for us here today. Okay, and I hope everyone can see my screen. All right. In order for us to appreciate this chapter, we need to get our bearings as to where we are. We are in the midst of Maimonides' negative theology, which is to define God in terms of what he is not, in order to distance ourselves from any mistaken conception of God, because human minds work in a certain way that would want to confine a definition of God into a 3 or 4 dimensional way of thinking that is bounded by time and space. And the Rambam goes to great effort in order to make sure that we don't make that mistake. Okay, so in the course of doing this, the Rambam has brought us down a number of different discussions that God cannot be compared to anything else, and that God cannot be affected by anything else, and so forth. In chapter 57, the Rambam says, I'm going to continue this discussion of trying to explain to you how God has no attributes, no intrinsic attributes. The only way that we can understand God is through his actions or the way that he interacts with our world. And he says on page 132 in the Pines edition, more obscure than what preceded, which means more amok. In the Hebrew, we say it's deeper. We're going to get a little bit deeper into this discussion. Now, before we start the actual text of chapter 57, we need to make 2 stops. Stop number 1 is the Rambam's words himself in Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah. The Rambam wrote the Mishnah Torah, and contained within the Mishnah Torah, at the very introduction to his magnum opus on Jewish law, on the codification of Jewish law, the Rambam actually codifies how a Jew is supposed to envision God in his or her own mind. And that's what's contained in the first chapter of the very first section of Mishneh Torah, called Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, the laws of the foundational ideas or concepts of the Torah. And in the first chapter, in Halacha Zayin, in paragraph 7, the Rambam talks about the uniqueness of God. And I want to go through this with you because it sort of acts as a foundation for what we're about to see when we talk about God now. So I hope everyone can see my screen. Ezra, just let me know if there's any problem. And I thank Ezra Hurwitz for being on the shiur today so that he can guide us in case there's any technical issues. But the Rambam writes as follows: Eloka zeh echad hu ve'eno shnayim v'lo yeter al shnayim. The God of the Jews, the God of the Torah, is completely unitary and does not have any kind of duality or more than a duality whatsoever. Ella echad, but purely one, purely unitary. She'ein ki yichudo echad min ha'achadim hanimtzaim ba'olam, that there is no other existent being that has the same kind of unitary nature that God has. Lo echad kimin shehu kolel achadim harbe, because God is not unitary in the sense that we think of unitary items. If I think of a unitary item, like I have a cup right here that I'm holding in my hand, well, it's one cup. but a cup is a plastic cup is made up of many constituent components. It's made up of many molecules. It's made up of many atoms. It's made up of many different ridges, and it's made up of a color. So it's made up of many different constituent components to make it into a unitary item. And it is not unitary like any physical, God is not unitary like any physical or corporeal thing that exists, which can be subdivided into smaller components. I can take this cup and I can take a knife and cut it up into different parts, into smaller pieces of plastic. Ela yichud she'ein yichud acher kemoto ba'olam. God's unitariness is unique, and there's nothing like it, anything else among anything else that exists. Ilu hayu Elohot harbe hayu gufin gviot. And then the converse is also true. If we could illustrate in our minds that there was more than one deity, we would be forced to say that those deities are corporeal, because oneness and lack of corporeality or lack of physical attributes go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. Because if two things are completely equivalent, they are indivisible, unless they are corporeal. In other words, if there were two deities, like certain beliefs of the Rambams in earlier times, like Manichaeism and Zoroastrianism, which believed in two deities, in order to be able to have two separate deities, they would need to have some physical attributes so that they could be in some way distinct and separate. Because otherwise, if two things are exactly alike and they have no physical attributes that pull them apart, they would coalesce into one unity. Furthermore, another argument to show that God is non-corporeal is the fact that God is eternal. So another attribute. So we have the uniqueness, we have a lack of corporeality, and we have God's eternality. God is an eternal being also. And if God were corporeal, he could not be eternal, because anything that has physical attributes is finite as far as time goes, because everything has a finite beginning and end when it is part of a physical frame of existence. And that's impossible to say about God, because that would imply that God is limited in his abilities. Because if God's essence is limited by by being bounded by time, then his power is limited by time. Ve'elokenu baruch shemo ho'il v'kocho ein lokates ve'eno posek shaharei hagalgal sovev tamid. And let us demonstrate God, our blessed God, has incessant and everlasting power. And the demonstration of this is that God never rests for a moment, because he's constantly maintaining the motion of the entire world in which we find ourselves. And we're not going to get into the idea of a galgal right now, but that's essentially, in a very rough way, what he means. Ein kocho koach guf, and therefore God's power is not in any way bounded by physicality. V'ho'il ve'ino guf lo ye'oreulo me'orot hagufot kidei sheyehi nechlak nifrad me'acher. And because God is completely non-corporeal, then he is not subject to any kind of change or any kind of division. Lefichach efshar sheyeh ela echad, and therefore, perforce, God must be unitary. V'yidiat davar zeh mitzvat aseh. And finally, the Rambam concludes by saying, and this is the Jewish law codification, that knowing or affirming this idea in one's mind is a positive commandment. As it says, Shema Yisrael, right? Hear, O Israel. That's really sort of charging you to know that this is a commandment. Hashem Elokeinu, the Lord is our God. Hashem Echad, God is unitary, and God is one, right? So this is the Rambam's introduction to this idea. Very, very logical. Basically, all of these things are philosophically linked to each other. Unitariness, eternality, uh, uh, God's um, and the fact that God is non-corporeal. These three things the Rambam has linked together in this halacha, and he's made a very, very logical case for it, in the sense that he's argued that philosophically it's impossible for something that is completely non-corporeal corporeal to be anything other than completely unitary, and vice versa. If something is completely unitary, it's impossible for it to be subject to division, unless and the two go hand in hand. One feeds into the other, and the same thing is true about God's eternality. Since God is non-corporeal, he must be infinite in nature. Okay, now that seems to be very straightforward, and for a person to fulfill the mitzvah of believing that Hashem is Echad, that the information that Rambam has provided to us in Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah is all that one needs to know. But it gets deeper than that in Moreh Nevukhim. This is really just an introduction to the information that the Rambam is going to give us in this chapter. And the only other thing that I wanted to point out as an introduction is something that the Rambam had told us 7 chapters ago in chapter 50. The Rambam takes a position that God is completely unknowable in his truest essence, and he pointed that out by saying that that's what God told to Moses when he said, "Upanai lo yera'u." It is impossible, Moshe, for you to gaze upon me and to understand me as I truly am. And the reason is because the human mind simply lacks the capability to grasp certain concepts, especially that which transcend the physical and the temporal existence in which we find ourselves. However, with that said, the Rambam feels that there is something graspable for the human mind to understand about God, and it is something that cannot even be articulated in human words. In other words, the Rambam's thesis is that the things that we can understand about God, because God is so transcendent and so mystical, as it were, in the sense that if you define the idea of what is mystical, that which cannot be contained within the human confines of experience, so then because God is so transcendent, art is when you can understand some semblance of what God is, but it will be impossible for you to articulate that concept into words, because words are as confined as the human mind is in working within a three-dimensional space and a temporal existence, a time-bound existence. So you can sometimes have flashes, like the Rambam wrote in his introduction to Moreh Nevukhim. Sometimes you can get flashes of clarity about God, but even when you get those flashes, it's not something that you can articulate into words. And he used the pasuk in Tehillim chapter 4, verse 5, where it says, Rigzu va'al techeto, that be filled with emotion or passion, but don't sin. Imru vilvavchem al mishkavchem, say certain things into your heart when you lie down, but v'domu sela, but be silent. In other words, your silence is because you are not able to summon the proper words to describe the idea that is formulating in your mind about God. So there is the possibility of formulating an idea, but it cannot be articulated. The words that we do choose to use are only a borrowed way of saying something that cannot be put into words. And Ludwig Wittgenstein, the modern philosopher of language, said that there are indeed things that cannot be put into words, as we quote from source number 3. They make themselves manifest. They are what is mystical. Okay, so that should lead us into an introduction to what we're about to talk about today. And the final thing that I wanted to mention as far as helping us try to understand this chapter 57 in Moreh Nevukhim, is that probably, we mentioned a week or two ago that there was a Muslim philosopher by the name of Muhammad al-Farabi, that had a profound influence upon the Rambam in many areas of ethics and politics, political philosophy. Probably when it comes to an understanding of God, a philosophy of God, probably the most influential philosopher was another Muslim philosopher on the Rambam's thinking, whose name was Ali ibn Sina. And in Latin, Ali ibn Sina is known as Avicenna. Avicenna lives in the late 10th and early 11th century and writes a lot that is based upon Aristotle and Plato. And he interprets it through a much more technical lens of philosophy. And I thought that it would be important, before we try to even make sense of what the Rambam writes in the first paragraph of chapter 57, that we take a look in an encyclopedia called the Stanford Encyclopedia of Plato and Philosophy, which I have the link for you in source number 4. And he gets into Ibn Sina's metaphysics, or Avicenna's metaphysics. I just have a few snippets that I thought would be worthwhile for us to understand. The first one is probably the most important idea, that the distinction between essence and existence, and this is the thing that the Rambam's going to talk about in the first paragraph. So, maybe we'll just take a stab at the first paragraph. We'll realize that it sounds like gobbledygook to us, and then we'll try to unpack it and make sense of it. So the Rambam writes, on the attributes more amok, deeper than what we had previously discussed, it is known that existence is an accident attaching to what exists. For this reason, it is something that is superadded to the quiddity of what exists. This is clear and necessary with regard to everything, the existence of which has a cause. Hence, its existence is something that is superadded to its quiddity. Now, you're not expected to understand those words. It is just complete gobbledygook, as I said. It just doesn't seem to make any sense what the Rambam has just said. There are two terms that we need to sort of get our heads around. One is existence, which in Hebrew would be mitziut. Mitziut means something that exists. And then the other one is mahut. And these are the Hebrew terms for their Arabic counterparts that the Rambam uses in describing this idea. The Rambam comes up with a very, very strange idea, and that is mahut, which he calls quiddity, or what we would call essence, the essence of a thing. You can have something that has essence but doesn't have existence. And what we mean by that is as follows. And let's take a look at this encyclopedia entry to Avicenna's thought. The analysis of being reveals two meanings of existence. The first affirms or establishes the existence of something. The second expresses, without affirming its existence, the reality by virtue of which something is what it is, namely its essence. The first is what Avicenna calls the existence related to the fact that something is established, el-wujud al-ithbati. The second identifies the particular or proper existence of the thing, al-wujud al-khas. As regards the latter, one is either not required to know whether the thing is or is not existent, or else one ignores the whole question. So what I'd like to do is just break this down into a much simpler terminology. I'm going to give you an example. My name is Daniel, okay? Now, I don't need to exist because it could be that my parents may never have met, and they may have never decided to have children, and then I wouldn't exist. But there is the concept of Daniel, what we call the mahut of this person who is speaking before you, who this is me, that there is such a concept of my existence even before I come into existence. And you could say that about basically anything in the physical world. The concept, its essence, the features of its existence can actually be real before the thing actually physically materializes into the real world. So the former we call the mahut of something, its essence, its characteristics, its features, its uniqueness. And then its existence is when it actually materializes into reality. It's mitziut. And that's what the Rambam is talking about. There are many things that can have essence or mahut, or what he calls quiddity, what Avicenna calls quiddity, but do not actually come into existence. Nor are they necessarily existent. And this is the point that we need to make is that the only necessarily existent being, the only being that must be nimtza, that must have existence, is God himself. There is no other being that needs to exist. The essence of that being may be a concept, right? But it doesn't, that the essence of that, of any other being, does not necessarily have to come into existence. God is the only necessary existence, because without God, nothing else can exist. And that is the essence of what Avicenna is trying to convey. I'm going to skip the next paragraph. Please, by all means, if you have access to this, download it. I've uploaded it to the webyeshiva.org page for the description of today's course. And it's also on the Facebook group Shiur in Moreh Nevukhim. So please download this text or go to the website for the plato.stanford.edu and the Ibn Sina metaphysics entry, and you can read more about this. In a paragraph, in section 4 of that same entry, he says the so-called distinction between essence and existence reveals an unavoidable modal characterization of being. The starting point of Avicenna's metaphysics is the existent, but the analysis Avicenna applies to it does not concern what exists insofar as it is existent, but instead concerns the modality that explains the relation that what exists has to its own existence. An existent can be either necessary in itself, wajib, or possible, mumkin. These are the Arabic terminologies in itself. This is the case of every existent, with the exception of the first principle, Avicenna's term for God. And so therefore, every existent being, it only has a possible existence. Only God has a necessary existence. I hope this makes a little bit, a semblance of sense to you, and I apologize for any lack of clarity that I'm not able to present it in any greater sense of clarity. But that's what the Rambam refers to. When he's talking about the unique meaning of existence when we talk about God. Everything else that exists in the world only has possible existence. Only God's existence is a necessary existence. And that's why when we talk about saying that God exists, God is a nimtza, his existence is unique. And therefore we cannot talk about God's existence in the same way that we talk about anything else in the world, anything else in the world that exists that is different from God, that is other than God. And that's really his whole point. We go to the next paragraph. As for that which has no cause for its existence, there is only God, may he be magnified and glorified, who is the only being who is not acted upon and caused to be brought about by anything else. For this is the meaning of our saying about him, may he be exalted, that his existence is necessary. Accordingly, his existence is identical with his essence and his true reality, and his essence is his existence. His mahut is his mitziut is his mahut. That's what we're trying to get to. Thus, his essence does not have an accident attaching to it when it exists, in which case its existence would be a notion that is superadded to it. And essentially what the Rambam is saying is, this is part and parcel of my whole discussion of removing any essential attributes from God. Because even using the Avicenna's definition of existence, even existence is an attribute to a thing. Because a thing can have an essential feature of what it is, but it doesn't necessarily exist. Existence, once something comes into a real existence in this world, is an attribute of that thing that is added to the essence of the thing. But because God's existence is necessary, it's not an attribute that is added to God, but rather it is part and parcel of him. That's the first point. We'll skip to the next paragraph. It is likewise necessary to know that oneness and multiplicity are also borrowed terms when we talk about God. When we say that God is unitary, It's not only that we're not understanding God's unitary existence because we think in a three-dimensional frame of mind, like the Rambam in Hilchot Yisodei HaTorah had said, because everything that is unitary can be broken down into smaller components. But it's not only that, but rather because God's oneness is the same thing as his, just like just like God saying that God exists is different from any other kind of existent being, so too saying that God is one is different from any other kind of unitary being. Just because it's not something that you can say is an attribute of God. Any kind of attribute, even saying that God is unitary, that God is one, would be adding something to God. And because God cannot have anything added to him, any kind of attributes that we try to ascribe to God is inappropriate to his absolute unity. Even saying that he is unitary is an attribute that is not appropriate to the ultimate unitary being. And this is what the dictionary entry points out when he talks about the henology or the unitary nature or the oneness of God. That clearly then not only Avicenna's ontology, God's existence, but also his henology, his oneness, should be understood in the light of the distinction between being and thing. The existent and the one are both primary indefinable concepts and necessary concomitants of a thing. But being a thing is different from existing and being one. Okay, and in the same way that these are things that are different from being, existence, and unity, when we talk about them in terms of God, we cannot talk about them as attributes. Now, so that's the second point. So we've talked about God's existence as being unique. We've talked about God's oneness or unitary nature as being unique. And now we're going to go a little bit further on. If you go to the bottom of the page, the Rambam says, these subtle, and by the way, the Rambam points out to us that in order to describe God as being one, we have to basically suggest that God is within the realm of things that are capable of being counted, and as either one or as numerous. And because God is completely outside of the category of countability, therefore his saying that he is one is only a borrowed term. We go to the bottom paragraph and he writes as follows: these subtle notions that very clearly elude the minds cannot be considered through the instrumentality of the customary words, which are the greatest among the causes leading unto error. In other words, yes, we simply lack vocabulary to articulate what we are trying to express in this chapter. For the bounds of expression in all languages are very narrow indeed, so that we cannot represent this notion to ourselves except through a certain looseness of expression. Again, our language will fail us. We can only approximate what we mean when we talk about God. And it goes back to that quote from Wittgenstein: there are indeed things that cannot be put into words, and that's the realm of the mystical. Thus, when we wish to indicate that the deity is not many, the one who makes the statement cannot say anything but that he is one, even though one and many are some of the subdivisions of quantity. But since God is not subject to quantification or quantity, therefore even saying that he is one is a misnomer. For this reason, we continue, we give the gist of the notion and give the mind the correct direction toward the true reality of the matter when we say one, but not through oneness. Just as we say eternal in order to indicate that he has not come into being in time. So saying that God is eternal is also a misnomer. If I could ask everyone to mute themselves, please. Saying that God is eternal is also a misnomer, because when you say that something is eternal, you're saying that it is a being that potentially can exist within a chronological frame, but that God's chronological framework has no beginning and no end. But God has no chronological frame. He's completely outside the concept of chronology. And therefore, saying that God is eternal is also a misnomer, just like saying that God is one is a misnomer, because God is outside the frame of quantity. For when we say eternal, we speak loosely, as is clear and manifest, since eternal can only be predicated of a thing to which time applies. Now, time is an accident of motion that is attached to a body. You can't have time without space. You can't have time without being part of a physical world. And eternal is likewise something correlated to time. Because when you say that something is eternal, it means it exists in all times. For your saying eternal is said with reference to the accident of time, similar to your saying long and short with reference to that other accidental line. But with regard to all the things to which the accident time is not attached, it cannot be truly predicated that they are eternal or that they come into being in time. So the Rambam is basically saying, using the word eternal to apply this to a being that is completely not within the framework of time is a misnomer. Just as it cannot be predicated of sweetness that it is either crooked or straight, because you're using terminology that is not at all applicable to that being. If I want to talk about a piece of candy and I want to describe its flavor, its sweetness, saying that the flavor is crooked or straight, this doesn't make any sense. It's a misnomer. We may use it as a borrowed way, or saying something is sharp when I want to describe its flavor, but I don't mean it's sharp, because sharp really, it's just a borrowed term, because sharp really refers to something that I can feel and not something that I can taste. And just as it cannot be predicated of sound, that it is either salty or insipid. These things are not hidden from one who is trained to understand notions according to their true reality, and has considered them with the apprehension that the intellect has of them, and in the manner the latter has of stripping them of accidents and matter, that is, has considered them not merely in the summary fashion of which words are indicative. Essentially, the Rambam is saying is that when you think about this carefully, you will realize that even the words that we use to describe God's infinitude, God's eternality, God's oneness, are not apt, truly apt. They are metaphorical terms to describe a being that transcends human vocabulary. All passages that you find in the scriptures in which it is predicated of him, may he be exalted, that he is the first and the last, like God says, Ani Rishon v'Ani Acharon, I am first and I am last, are analogous to those in which it is predicated of him that he has an eye or an ear. These are just borrowed terms, just like God has no eyes or ears, but we talk about him as having eyes and ears, and it's meant metaphorically. The same thing is true here. The purpose of this is to indicate that he, may he be exalted, is not subject to change, and that no notion is produced in him anew. It is not meant to indicate that God, may he be exalted, falls under the rubric of time, so there would be some analogy between him and that which is other than he and is in time. And that's not what is meant when we say that God is first and last. All these words as applied to him are Dibra Torah Kilshon B'nei Adam. The Torah speaks in human language to be able to give us some level of connection. Similarly, when we say one, the meaning is that he has no equal, and not that the notion of oneness attaches to his essence. And so essentially what the Rambam has said as we continue down this rabbit hole is that no matter what we're going to say about God, our language will fail us. And that's a good way to continue along this discussion, because the Rambam is going to take us down even further in chapter 58, and this is where we will conclude for today. Are there any questions from anyone who's on the call today? If not, I will stop the share, and we will finish the class for today. And I look forward to your participation next time. Take care, everybody.